So two of these. But this one for me is, so we're going to 2000. And I'm going to be honest, some of these films I didn't really watch when they were released, including this one. For obvious reasons. Final Destination. So I like Final Destination. There is Final Destination 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I'm going to talk about both 2, 3, 4, 5 and Bloodlines, which I think was this year, in the respective years. Because 2 and 3 will actually appear in other stuff. In both 2003 and 2006. So yeah, I do actually have other stuff that I have around it. So yeah, there is some stuff that is connected. But 2000, why do I like Final Destination? More specifically, just the first one. I know there's the second one, but I'll talk about the second one in 2003 and the third one in 2006. And I won't really talk about the fourth and fifth one, besides a little bit, because I feel like I do need to explain myself a bit in some of the other stuff. But I like the first one. The first one's a lot more simple compared to the others. Definitely like when you get to, I would say 5's not as complicated. But when you get into 4 and even 2 and 3, with certain things and how the world works, they get a bit more detail of like how this works and that works. With 1, there were some odd things, but it was sort of unexplained. For instance, you have the entire intro, which shows all of the Final Destination's deaths, which is interesting. And again, a lot of people are pointing out the small details. The best one that I like is there's a video by CZ's World, which goes through every single Final Destination and sees the small details and the small hints to how it could have been foreshadowed. Which again, I absolutely love together. Like I'll talk about one of my favorite things that you see in the second one, because one of my favorite ones is in the second one. But you get stuff like, before Todd dies, you get his name, a scrap of his name, in the sort of book that is broken up. You get a certain repeating number of 180, which is Flight 180 and the original incident that started all this off. Again, there is so many small stuffs. The only thing which I don't like, which they do have in this, in most of the deaths, even in 4 and 5, it's mostly, this is an accident, you can clearly see it here and here, there's much evidence to prove that. And this one, I fully don't mind the water being a thing. Like, if it's like, you could fully be like, do you know, weird pattern, but the water has this effect, but it probably was just a very odd chance that this happens. But I don't like it being like, and now I retreat into the forest. I'm like, I don't like that, because I prefer the idea that death just does one of those things where it's like how I imagine it is somewhat the wind is there. It's sort of like that, it's sort of like I'm not going to say it's just the wind, no. But I do like the idea that rather than the wind being like, but it's more like he comes in and just nicks something. So I like the idea of the water because you can get that a bit. But I just like the idea of that. Obviously it's not canon, but I don't like the fact that the water goes back, because that's a bit odd. But I think a couple of people pointed that out. It's the only time that death tries to be like, oh yes, that wasn't true with me. But it didn't work. Obviously, retrospective, some things need to be looked at in a little bit more detail, which I will talk about because it is important. So we're going to Final Destination 5 for the first one. So the first incident, obviously there's some people that aren't exactly matched because Final Destination 1 didn't know that Final Destination 5 was going to exist, obviously. Unless you're really smart, you don't plan that far ahead and that many directors, because it's not done by the same director. I don't think the first one and the third one is in. The third one and the fifth one is, so I don't know. But obviously the fifth one is for the first one. I think this was meant to keep the fourth one being the final destination, but it doesn't exactly work because now Bloodline exists. But I'll get into that in a sec. But again, I'll talk about these small things, but I like the idea of that. But it means that I like, because they do this more on the second one, and I'll talk about that idea in the second one, but they do have this idea even hinted here that something's happening that makes the people on the sort of bus, on the plane go, oh, we need to do this, we need to do this. Obviously in the fourth one, I disagree with this idea, some people are pointing this out. I feel like, oh yes, the like Final Destination, the visions are from death, there's no choice at all. I disagree with that heavily. Because the idea that he's doing all of this work to just show them visions, I've always been with the idea, even though I like life and death being sort of like somewhat like best friends. Look at the Lonely Grim Reaper story, which is like absolutely written amazingly. But I always imagine that the visions are by life, in a way, trying to be like, we want these people to live. But I do still like the idea that impacted it. And obviously later down the line, because Bloodworth is in Bloodlines, he's in this. And you now realize, oh yeah, that's because there's some things of like him being like, you cannot cheat death, you cannot do this, there's some rules. And like all of those are like interesting to like the point of like, here are the rules of death, here are the rules, how it works. And it's like, for the longest time, legitimately, I even had it as a thing in my head being like, this is a thing. Obviously there was two things I had in my head, which is one, the CC's world interpretation, which was legitimately confirmed, which was he was a prior victim. Part of the theory was incorrect because part of it was before Final Destination 3, which he's not in, he dies. Bloodlines proves otherwise. He does die, I think, off screen. But the other thing that I had a theory of, that Bloodworth was death in some way. And that, so, because he has this present, he has this energy of like, yes, you cannot cheat death. It felt like, you cannot cheat me. Obviously it was proved incorrect. He's human and he was one of the previous person, but I'm not going to talk about that yet. But I like how those two things, I think, level it up. It makes Final Destination 1 not like a... It is interesting that it was like, what, how did this start? Because Final Destination 1 usually is like Final Destination 1 starts Final Destination 2, and then usually Final Destination 3 has, I don't think, any connection, but Final Destination 1 and 2 have a huge connection. But I'll talk about that. But because of this, that means 5, 1, 3, it sort of has an impact, which makes it interesting. It also means that we know why Bloodworth knew literally so much about it, because he was one of the people beforehand. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you liked this. There's gonna be another one of these because I want to, but I hope you enjoy, and good night.